Is asbestos an animal, vegetable, or mineral? Answers to that question on this episode of Asbestos Artifacts. Welcome to Asbestos Artifacts, where we take a look at some old asbestos products and dig a little bit into the story behind them. I'm asbestos attorney Justinian Lane. So is asbestos an animal, vegetable, or a mineral? Well, in a way, that's a trick question. Asbestos is definitely not a vegetable or an animal, but humans once believed it was. And in fact, asbestos is not a mineral, it's an industry name for a group of minerals that all have similar qualities useful for building and products. The most well-known quality of asbestos is that it's extremely resistant to fire. Asbestos generally burns at temperatures hundreds or even 1,000 degrees hotter than the average house fire, and asbestos fiber is often one of the few items left in the charred remains of a massive building fire. And that gets us to today's asbestos artifacts. This 2-pack of playing cards with the Bestobell logo, imprinted with the symbol of asbestos, a fire salamander, surrounded by fire and unburned by the flames. Written beneath the logo are these words: "The salamander, lively and unscathed in the heart of flame, is a symbol of asbestos." So why exactly is the salamander the symbol of asbestos? Before we get to that, let's go a bit further back to the first recorded descriptions of asbestos in human history. Several of the ancient Greeks and Romans knew of and used asbestos. The Greeks called it lithos amiantos, meaning a rock unstained or untainted, and probably referred to its tendency to get cleaner and whiter in fire. The ancient Greek geographer and historian Strabo noticed its fibrous nature, calling it a stone which is combed. Strabo was probably referring to chrysotile, the most commonly used type of asbestos, which looks like fur growing on a rock. Chrysotile can be woven into thread and fabric like cotton or wool. That fibrous quality is what Strabo called combed. But he clearly realized asbestos was a mineral. Not so for the ancient Roman historian Pliny the Elder. Asbestos fabric appeared almost magical. I mean, it is fireproof. Asbestos thread can burn and burn without being consumed, and both the ancient Romans and Greeks described using asbestos thread in religious temples to support everlasting lamps. They also used it for cremation shrouds, as did royal courts in medieval Asia. The bodies would burn, but the shrouds would not, leaving the ashes easily collected for placement in a tomb. But much of Pliny's naturalist writings are based on stories he heard and other writings he read. It doesn't appear he ever actually saw asbestos himself. Pliny calls asbestos fabric living linen. Linen was the most common fabric in lamp wicking used in the ancient world, and it was woven from the linseed plant. So Pliny seems to think asbestos is similarly a vegetable, describing it as impervious to fire because it grows in the hot deserts of India. Even if Pliny did see it, or a drawing or description of it, like we said, asbestos can look a lot like fur or moss growing on a rock, and it doesn't behave like most rocks, being a fiber, so the mistake is understandable. But by the Middle Ages, asbestos seems to have become the stuff of legend. In Europe, there was the tale of Emperor Charlemagne, who is said to intimidate rivals by inviting them for dinner on his asbestos tablecloth, then having his servants throw it into the fire to burn off the food, withdrawing it clean and white. Chrysotile is actually called white asbestos because once processed and heated, it grows gleaming white, and its flakes were even used for snow in old Hollywood movies. Europeans in the Middle Ages had awareness of asbestos and its fireproof cloth, but most believed tales that it came from a fireproof animal. And that animal is right here on today's artifact, the salamander. The symbol of asbestos, an unburned salamander engulfed in flames. Now let's take a quick biological detour. Lizards are reptiles, they live on land. Salamanders are amphibians, more like frogs, and they can walk and breathe on land and swim and breathe in water. One common type of salamander seen in the forests of Europe are fire salamanders. Fire salamanders have bright yellow markings which warn other creatures about the neurotoxin they secrete, a survival strategy known as aposematism. The other thing about fire salamanders is that they like to live in old rotten tree trunks, which stay moist. Often when the wood was burned, the fire salamanders would emerge and people interpreted it as the salamander unbothered by the fire. And unlike other lizards or reptiles, salamanders could also take to creeks and other water bodies in forest fires and were often seen crawling on the ashy forest floor left behind. Observers began to say that fire salamanders couldn't be burned. Like fish were associated with water and birds with air, salamanders were fire animals. Legendary big-brain Leonardo da Vinci went as far as positing that salamanders ate fire. And somewhere along the way, the unburnable salamander and fire-resistant asbestos cloth legends were associated, and it seemed reasonable to enough people who thought that leeches were a good idea that asbestos cloth must be made of salamanders, or at least fur growing on their skin. And so alchemists called asbestos salamander wool. Before the 19th century, asbestos was extremely rare, so that contributed a great deal to its mythical status. Most philosophers writing about asbestos cloth being woven of salamander wool were repeating myths they read in other books, and it was a cool story to believe. But Marco Polo called shenanigans. In his travels to China, the Italian merchant was one of those medieval rarities who actually saw asbestos cloth. Several Mongolian traders showed him what he calls salamander, a cloth owned by elites and prized for its fire resistance. But Polo is dubious of the claim that asbestos cloth is made of fur, much less lizard fur. A Turkish friend of his says Polo's doubts are founded, explaining that asbestos is not an animal, adding that no animal can live in fire. This cloth is woven from a rock dug from the ground. Being the kind of guy Marco Polo is, he goes to see it himself, visiting an asbestos mine in China. In the books of his travels, Polo lays out a clear description of asbestos mining and processing. The way they got them was by digging in that mountain till they found a certain vein. The substance of this vein was then taken and crushed, and when so treated, it divides as if it were fibers of wool, which they set forth to dry. When dry, these fibers were pounded into a great copper mortar and then washed, so as to remove all the earth and to leave only the fibers like fibers of wool. These were then spun and made into napkins. When first made, these napkins are not very white, but by putting them into the fire for a while, they come out as white as snow, and so again, whenever they become dirty, they're bleached by being put into the fire. Now this, and naught else, is the truth about the salamander, and the people of the country all say the same. Any other account of the matter is fabulous nonsense. But the legend stuck, and even as people began to understand that asbestos is a mineral, in the 18th century, performers known as human salamanders would perform stunts in fireproof asbestos clothing. As a fireproof cloth, asbestos was fundamental to the steam and industrial revolutions, wrapping everything from boilers to factories to refineries to suburbs and even rockets to the moon. But the salamander symbol persisted like asbestos fibers, which are stronger than steel and resistant not only to fire, but also chemicals, rust, noise, and electricity. That's why asbestos was used for insulation of so many kinds, from thermal to electrical to acoustic, and the Asbestos Insulators Union adopted the flame-engulfed salamander as their symbol. Drinking from the same well was Bell's Asbestos, a large British-based company that made asbestos products of all kinds. As it says on these playing cards, their products were sold under the registered trademark Bestobell. They also depict this salamander, note the webbed feet of an amphibian, practically yawning in the face of flames. As far as we can tell, these cards do not contain asbestos. But one product that Bell's Asbestos did sell under their Bestobell trademark seems worth a look. Bestobell provided a lot of products to the emerging aviation industry in the early 20th century, including protective suits for mechanics and others working around the nascent jet industry. Jets fly by burning fires with jet fuel, so aviation protective suits need to be highly fire resistant. And so the reference to salamander wool on Bestobell's playing card seems appropriate. A bit like 18th century asbestos-clad human salamanders doing stunts, Bestobell helped humans resist fire in asbestos suits. Unfortunately, asbestos is a known carcinogen capable of causing respiratory diseases and multiple cancers by inhaling or swallowing its microscopic fibers. And that's the tragedy, irony, and paradox of what was once called salamander wool. Asbestos can protect us from fire, but breathing it can kill you. Bell was a North American face of the British asbestos company Turner & Newell, one of the oldest and most notorious asbestos companies whose abysmal practices in southern Africa we've covered in other episodes. If only the asbestos industry had told everyone that they knew it was making people sick and that it causes cancer, possibly asbestos precautions might have reduced the exposures of millions of workers and their families. But even the National Cancer Institute says that there is no safe level of asbestos exposure. So maybe it's a good thing that asbestos suits and products have gone the way of professions like alchemy. By the way, it's unclear how many salamanders that alchemists thought it would take to make Charlemagne's tablecloth, or why they thought salamanders have hair, and there's no records if anyone ever tried to harvest the skin. It's probably for the best, because salamanders excrete a potentially lethal neurotoxin. So whether you believe that asbestos is made from a mineral like chrysotile, an animal like salamanders, or a vegetable like Pliny did, maybe try not making a suit out of it. If you're bored, you could always play some cards instead. I'm asbestos attorney Justinian Lane. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe, and tune in next week for another episode of Asbestos Artifacts.